Hey everyone, remember when I said I'd paint some Iron Warriors like 4 months ago? Well, here we are, baby. I've finally done it. Life is super busy right now, but let's get into how I painted this Iron Warrior Terminator proxy. Before I primed this model, I glued some small chain around his waist and put some trophies on there, some skulls and a head. You could argue that Iron Warriors don't necessarily take trophies or whatnot, but I think it looks cool and I think that's all that matters. First, we're going to start by using some Chaos Black primer. Any color of primer will do. I usually just use Chaos Black because I feel like it works best for me, but that's just my opinion. Now to get started, I'm going to grab some Iron Warriors paint from Citadel and essentially coat the whole model in it. You can thin this down a little bit if you'd like. From what I've read and experienced, metallic paints don't need a ton of thinning, and I found so long as I don't overload my brush with metallic paint, I'm good. Next, I'm going to work on the gold trim, and here I'm using some Pro Acryl Bright Gold. Next, it's time to work on what makes the Iron Warriors iconic stylistically, and that is hazard stripes. Now, this particular model has separations where each stripe is going to be, so in a way, I'm cheating because I don't have to make the stripe myself. But as in my Scimitar video, I'm going to build up the tones with red, orange, and our final yellow on the whole panel. Then you can go back and slowly work on adding in black stripes. So starting here, I'm using Gory Red to start basing in where I'm going to have the stripes be. Now that we have our red nice and opaque, let's move on to the orange, and here I'm using Orange Fire from Vallejo. Same process as before, use thin coats and build up to a nice opaque orange. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with some Moon Yellow. Now it's time to actually add the stripes, and there are a few different ways you can do this. Other mini painters have great tutorials on how to do this, and since my model has notches where the stripes are going, I don't have to worry about that much on this. But some of the ways I've seen are using masking tape, cutting out the stripes, and taping them onto your model, then using black to fill in. Another way is to get a sharp pencil and sketch in the stripes, and using that as a guide to your stripes. Or you can just grab your black paint and start eyeballing it. No matter what method you choose, just remember it takes practice and patience, and it's okay to mess up a line. Just go back to your yellow and fix any mistake and just press forward. So we got our stripes finished. Let's add some highlights to the metal, and for that I'm going to use some Stormhost Silver and do some highlighting on the sharper points on the model where we did our Iron Warriors. For the head on his back waist, I'm basing that with Pallid Witch Flesh from Citadel, and for the skulls on the front, I'm using Rakarth Flesh. Going back to the head, I'm using some Ryclan Flesh Shade and giving it a light coat to bring in a little bit of color. To add some variation to our model, I'm going to be using some Pro Acryl Bronze to add some of that variation to the axe handle. And for the handle wrap, we're using Rhinox hide. Now while we have our brown out, let's add some chipping into the armor. Here I'm using a small piece of foam that I ripped off a makeup wedge. I dip it into our Rhinox hide. I get most of the excess off so I have better control of the amount that I'm putting on the model. Then I start dabbing it on somewhat randomly to add in those chip effects. And here is our model with all of our base colors on. For the axe, I'm going to be attempting to do a forged blade look on that, so I'm going to wait till after our wash to start working on that. And for our wash, I'm using AK Interactive Winter Streaking Grime in a rough 50-50 mix with some odorless mineral spirits. And using a cheap brush, I cover the entire model with this stuff, making sure to get complete coverage. Then, once applied, I don't usually wait any set amount of time before I get a Q-tip, lightly dampen it with some mineral spirits, and then start wiping and dabbing the excess wash off. If it gets too much on the Q-tip, I just grab another and continue working until I feel like I have the right amount on there, which can be a little bit tricky if you're not used to working with enamel washes, but if you stick with it, it becomes easier every time you do it. After you have either let it dry or I just blast it with a hair dryer to help speed up the process, I grab some black wash and I start recess shading the armor to get separations and more definition onto our model. Going back to our Iron Warriors, I'm going to add some fresh wear and tear on our armor by doing some edge highlighting on the sharper points. And speaking of wear and tear, I'm going to add some rust. Now, I really like adding rust to my models, but with that being said, some people don't, which is totally fine because they're your models. So if you don't want to add rust, just give this step a little skippy skip. But if you do want to add some rust, here I'm using some dirty down rust and applying multiple layers to get the desired effect that I want. Now here's a little advice: if you do grab this stuff, just remember to take like a toothpick or something, something you can get down in the bottom and scrape any possible sediment off the bottom. Maybe think about putting a mixing bowl in there and make sure you really shake it up really good so it comes out of the bottle with the desired finish. Also, this stuff is water soluble, so if you just want to add some streaking effects, after you apply it, just dip your brush in a little water and start working the rust a little bit, just up and down so you get a nice streak. Now onto the blade. I'm going to be using the red, orange, and yellow from the hazard stripes earlier and adding in a little bit of white to start attempting to make this effect. Starting with red, work in thin layers to build up to a nice opaque color. Then moving on to orange, we're going to start working on toward where the blade would be more hot towards the main body of the axe. As you can see here, I have quite a bit of thinned down paint on my brush here, and currently that's on purpose. Overloading your brush like this adds some unique drawing patterns to the axe, which I kind of like, so even though it's a little subtle. Now onto our yellow, bringing it closer to the middle of the axe here and letting it dry before adding more. It's important to take your time with this process and be patient. Looking back at it now, I'm like 99% sure I rushed this part for one reason or another, which isn't super fair to you guys since I'm trying to show you how to do this, and the end result suffered because of that, so I apologize. Next, I'm going to take some thin down white and paint it where we're going to have it be a little bit pale close to the middle. Looking at reference photos of forged metal, there are hints and tones of pale yellow where our glow would be coming from. After that white is dry, let's go back to our yellow, thin it down, and here we're going to brush it right on where we added our white to create a brighter yellow. Now from here we can do any correcting that as we see fit, so I'm going to go back to orange and do some touch up around the axe. I'm also going to take this time to glaze this orange on both sides of the middle bar of the axe to create some subtle glow as if the axe is radiating heat. And going back to our yellow to add some small highlights on the edges closest to the axe's body. Now I'm going back to our Rhinox hide and adding in some chips, if that's the right word, to where the axe would be the coolest, near the edges of the axe blade and where the axe would be the thickest. I decided to have the eyes from the helmet and the lens around it to be an orangish red, which looking back at now, I would have changed it to be a cooler color, just because there's already so much yellow and red on this model. It would have created a better looking contrast, but I can't go back in time, even though I keep trying. So using the same process as the axe essentially, I use red to base everything and then using thinned down orange to start making the highlights. Finishing up before we're going to work on the base, I'm going to use some max matte varnish on our hazard stripes to create some surface contrast between the metal and the hazard stripe areas. Now onto the base. Now I forgot to film this, but I used some AK muddy ground and placed some small slate rocks onto there, going around the bigger rock that is part of the model. Starting with some Mechanicus Gray, I'm going to be using this to base the rocks. Next, I'm going to dry brush some Dawnstone. After the Dawnstone is dry, I'm moving on to doing the same thing but with Administratum Gray. Now for the earth around the rocks, I'm going to paint this with Citadel's Dryad Bark. Once that is dry, I'm going to be using Gorthar Brown and doing some dry brushing onto the earth. And then using Carrick Stone, going over the whole base to add in some warmer tones to the rock and bring out some more detail on the ground. Next it's time for a wash, and here I'm using AK Dark Brown Wash, thinned down a little with some mineral spirits and covering the whole model. And like our wash before, once that is applied, going back with a Q-tip and working the excess off. After that is dry, go back to your Carrick Stone and do another dry brush over the whole model to bring in some highlights. With our model glued back onto our base, it's time to unify it just a little bit, and I'm using AK Dirt to do that by applying it to the feet and shins sparingly, or as much as you would prefer. I'm also putting some onto the base around the feet as well. And with that, this model is done. Now looking back at it now, the forged effect on the axe is okay. I had a hard time doing this on an axe for whatever reason, where I've been doing this pretty well on a sword before, so I'm not super sure what happened there. I also think adding in some contrasting colors, maybe to the lens and eyes, would have been a better approach, but I think the model turned out rather well regardless. Thank you everyone for stopping by and watching. Even if you didn't like it or didn't learn anything, I hope this motivates you to paint your models at the minimum and maybe try new techniques if you haven't. If you would like to see more work, I'm a little bit more active on my Instagram or Reddit. I'll post links to either of those in the description. Everyone take care and have a great day. Till next time.